There is a silence that lives in the space between a final breath and the first cry of a new life, a sacred quiet where all the world's hope and sorrow meet. It was a silence Ilara had come to know intimately, for she lived within it. Hope was the faint, fluttering life inside her, a promise whispered in the dark. Sorrow was the wasting sickness that clung to her bones, the cold judgment in the eyes of her village, the undeniable truth that she and her child were dying together, unheard and unseen. They said a woman's worth was in the life she could bring forth, but her life was being stolen by the very miracle she carried. The world had promised her bloom, and instead, it gave her rot. It was a profound and lonely betrayal, the kind that hollowed a soul until it was nothing but a fragile shell, waiting for the tide to finally break it apart. She was a ghost, haunting her own life, a vessel for a death that had already begun. The cough came again, a dry, rasping thing that tore at her throat and left her gasping against the damp stone wall of her hovel. It was less a sound of sickness, and more the sound of her body tearing itself apart from the inside. Each spasm sent a lance of pain through her ribs, and she curled tighter around her swollen belly, a reflexive, futile gesture of protection. The child within her stilled, as if sensing the tremor of her decay. "I'm sorry," she thought, the words a silent prayer against the rough wool of her blanket. "I'm so sorry, little one. I wanted to give you sunshine and song." Instead, she had given it this. A cold, dark place at the edge of a village that wished them both gone. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, but beneath it, she could always smell the faint, sweet odor of her own decline. It clung to her skin, a perfume of endings. Her hair, once the color of polished chestnut, was dull and brittle, and her skin, stretched thin over her bones and the curve of her womb, had a gray, translucent quality. She was fading, a watercolor painting left out in the rain. The village of Oak Haven was nestled in a valley, cradled by mountains that clawed at the sky. It was a place of stubborn tradition and even more stubborn fear. When Yorick, the father of her child, had cast her out, the village had followed his lead. Her pregnancy was a shame, but her sickness was a curse. They saw it as a blight, a dark omen brought on by her weakness, her sin. Whispers followed her like shadows when she dared to walk to the well, their words sharper than the winter wind. Tainted, unclean. The rot has taken her. Her own mother would not meet her eyes, leaving bread and water on the threshold of the abandoned hut they'd given her, as if crossing it might invite the same fate. Ilara had stopped trying to speak to them weeks ago. Their cruelty was a wall she no longer had the strength to climb. Her world had shrunk to these 4 stone walls, the scratchy blanket, and the secret, precious life that depended on her failing body. This isolation was a different kind of death, a slow severing of every thread that had once tied her to the world. She pushed herself up, her joints screaming in protest. Thirst. It was a constant burning need. The water bucket was nearly empty, its contents murky. It meant a trip to the stream, a journey that felt like crossing a continent. She wrapped the threadbare blanket around her shoulders, the cold of the floor seeping through the thin soles of her leather shoes. Outside, the world was painted in shades of gray. A persistent drizzle fell from a colorless sky, turning the path to mud. The trees of the Whisperwood loomed at the edge of the valley, their dark, skeletal branches a constant, menacing presence. Legend said the woods were alive, that they belonged to a king who was more beast than man, a king who devoured trespassers. Ilara shivered, a tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. Sometimes, in the dead of night, she thought she could hear a howl from those woods, a sound so lonely and profound it vibrated in her very bones, a perfect echo of the desolation in her own heart. She told herself it was just the wind, It was easier than believing something truly wild was so close. As she reached the stream, its water running clear and cold over smooth stones, a sudden commotion erupted from the village square. Shouts, the thunder of hooves. It was a sound Oakhaven hadn't heard in a generation. Visitors were rare. Armed visitors were unheard of. Alara instinctively shrank back, trying to make herself small behind a gnarled willow tree. A dozen riders, clad in black leather and dark steel, galloped into the village, their horses huge and restless, breathing plumes of steam into the frigid air. They moved with a predatory grace that was utterly alien to the simple farmers and craftsmen of Oakhaven. At their center rode a man on a stallion the color of midnight. He was taller than the others, broader in the shoulder, and he wore his authority not like a crown, but like a second skin. Even from this distance, his presence was a physical force, a weight that settled over the valley and silenced the birds. The village elders, led by the stern-faced Maeve, scurried out to meet them, their faces a mixture of terror and awe. Ilara couldn't hear their words, but she could see the stiff, fearful bows, the way they avoided the lead rider's gaze. He, however, did not look at them. His head turned slowly, surveying the village, his gaze sweeping over the huddled cottages, the muddy square, the frightened faces peeking from behind shutters. His eyes, even from afar, seemed to burn with an unnatural intensity. And then they stopped. They stopped on her. Across the distance, through the rain, past the willow branches, his gaze found her. It was not a glance. It was an impact. The world seemed to fall away, the noise of the village fading to a dull hum. He saw her, not just the shape of a woman by the stream, but her. He saw the sickness, the swelling of her belly, the crushing weight of her despair. She felt it, the way a field feels the coming storm. Other men looked at her with pity or disgust. He looked at her with an unnerving, absolute focus, an expression of stark recognition that stole the breath from her lungs. For the first time in months, Ilara felt something other than the slow crawl of death. It was a terrifying, electric jolt of pure, unadulterated fear. And beneath it, something else. Something that felt, impossibly, like being found. The Alpha King had come to Oakhaven, and his eyes were fixed on the one person the village had already thrown away. His gaze held her captive. It was a physical connection, a taut line drawn between the powerful, still figure on the war horse and the broken woman huddled by the water. She could not look away, could not breathe. The world narrowed to the space between them, a silent, charged battlefield of observation. He was everything she was not, vibrant, radiating a raw power that seemed to warp the very air around him, while she was a fading echo, a life slipping through the cracks of the world. His face was stark, carved from granite and shadow, with a severe beauty that was both breathtaking and terrifying. A scar, pale and thin, cut through one dark eyebrow, a flaw that only served to highlight the perfection of the rest. He did not move, did not speak to the stammering elders at his feet. His entire being was focused on her, and in that focus there was no judgment, no revulsion. There was only an unnerving, predatory stillness, a deep and unsettling curiosity. She saw a flicker of something in those dark, piercing eyes, something ancient and wild, a fire that had never been tamed. It was the look of a wolf that has scented its quarry, but this was not the hunger of a predator for prey. It was something far more complex, something that resonated with the lonely howl she sometimes heard from the woods. The moment shattered when one of his guards murmured something to him. The king, Kalin, as the whispers from the village would later name him, finally broke their shared gaze. He dismounted in a single fluid motion, his heavy boots sinking into the mud with a soft squelch. He was immense, a giant of a man whose presence dwarfed everyone around him. He gave a curt order to his men, his voice a low rumble that carried on the damp air, a sound that seemed to vibrate in Alara's bones. His men began to move through the village, their purpose unclear, their movements efficient and intimidating. The villagers scattered before them like frightened chickens. But Kalen did not follow. He handed the reins of his stallion to a guard and began to walk, not toward the center of the village, but directly toward the stream. Directly toward her. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Alara. She scrambled backward, her foot slipping on a moss-covered rock. She fell hard, the impact jarring through her body. A fresh wave of pain radiating from her hip. A small, pathetic cry escaped her lips. She was trapped. A wounded animal with the apex predator approaching. She expected him to stop, to loom over her from a distance. He did not. He closed the remaining space in a few long strides, his shadow falling over her like a shroud. He knelt. Not with the condescension of a king to a peasant, but with a strange, deliberate grace, bringing his formidable presence down to her level. He was so close now she could see the flecks of silver in his dark eyes, like chips of starlight in a midnight sky. She could smell the scent of pine, rain, and something else, something musky and wild, the scent of the deep woods itself. He reached out a hand. It was large and calloused, a warrior's hand, yet his movement was slow, gentle, giving her every chance to retreat. She flinched, pressing herself against the cold, wet earth. His hand stopped, hovering in the air between them. He said nothing. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken things. This close, the force of his vitality was overwhelming. It was like standing next to a forge, the heat of him a stark contrast to the deathly chill that had become her constant companion. His gaze dropped from her face to the taut swell of her stomach, where her child lay hidden. A muscle in his jaw tightened. He knows, a frantic voice screamed inside her head. He knows I'm dying. He can see it. He can smell it. She braced herself for the disgust, the dismissal. It was all she had known for months, but it never came. Instead, his eyes softened with an emotion she could not name. It was not pity. It was something fiercer, something that looked almost like pain, a shared pain. He finally spoke, and his voice was exactly as she'd imagined, a low, resonant baritone that seemed to hum with contained power. You are hurt. It was not a question. It was a simple statement of fact. His voice was a physical touch, vibrating through the air and into her. She could only stare, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She tried to find her own voice, to tell him to leave her be, but the words wouldn't form. Fear and shock had stolen them. He slowly retracted his hand and rose to his full, intimidating height. He looked back toward the village, his expression hardening into an unreadable mask of command. He issued another order, this one sharp and clear. 2 of his men immediately broke away and strode toward the largest building in the village, the inn, a place Alara had not been welcome in for a very long time. The innkeeper, a stout man named Borin who had always been quick with a cruel word, came rushing out, wringing his hands, his face pale with fear. The king's men brushed past him as if he were a fly. A moment later, they emerged carrying blankets, a water skin, and a small loaf of bread. They brought them to the king, their movements precise and deferential. He took the offerings without a word and turned back to her, knelt again, placing the items on the ground beside her. The blanket was thick, clean wool, impossibly soft. The bread smelled fresh and warm. It was more kindness than she had received in a year, and it came from the most terrifying man she had ever seen. Eat, he commanded gently. Drink. He made no move to help her, leaving the choice entirely hers. He simply waited, his patience a silent, powerful force. Her body screamed with hunger, with thirst, with the deep, aching need for warmth. Hesitantly, her trembling fingers reached for the water skin. The water was cool and clean, a balm to her raw throat. Then she tore off a piece of the bread. It was soft, and she chewed it slowly. The simple taste an explosion of sensation in her mouth. She had been living on stale crusts and watery broth for so long. This was a feast. She ate, acutely aware of his eyes on her, watching her every move. He was not just giving her charity. He was observing her, studying her with an intensity that stripped her bare. She felt exposed, vulnerable, yet for the first time she did not feel judged. He was simply witnessing her. And in that act of silent witness, a tiny, forgotten seed of something, not hope, it was too fragile for that name, began to stir in the barren soil of her heart. This powerful, dangerous man saw her suffering, and he had not turned away. He had knelt in the mud and offered her comfort. It was a gesture so profound, so utterly unexpected, that it frightened her more than any threat could. It was an act that made no sense, and things that made no sense in Oakhaven were always dangerous. Days bled into a week, and the king and his men remained. They occupied the inn and several surrounding cottages, their presence a heavy blanket of unease over the village. The villagers moved with a new, quiet caution, their usual boisterous gossip silenced, their cruelties muted by fear. Kalen himself was an enigma. He spoke little, his dark-clad warriors his instruments in the world. They requisitioned supplies with polite, unyielding authority, paying in silver coins that shone with a foreign luster. But their purpose in Oakhaven remained a mystery. Alara watched from a distance, her fear warring with a strange, burgeoning fascination. She saw him train his men in the muddy fields, his movements a blur of deadly grace. She saw him consult maps with his lieutenants, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was a king, a commander, a force of nature. And yet, every day, he found her. It was never a direct confrontation after that first day. It was subtle. A skin of fresh goat's milk left on her doorstep before dawn. A bundle of dry firewood appearing beside her hut while she slept. Once she found a small, intricately carved wooden bird on her windowsill, its tiny wings poised for flight. She knew with a certainty that settled deep in her soul that they were from him. These were not the actions of a tyrant. They were the gestures of a guardian, Eaf Hassah, silent protector moving in the shadows of her life. She never saw him leave the gifts, but she felt his presence. Sometimes a flicker of movement at the edge of the woods, or the unnerving sensation of being watched, would alert her. When she looked, there was nothing but trees and shadow, but she knew he was there. He was a ghost of a different sort, haunting the periphery of her desolate world, and his haunting felt less like a threat and more like a vigil. Her health, however, continued its inexorable decline. The small comforts he provided could not halt the disease that was consuming her. The coughing fits grew more violent, leaving her dizzy and breathless. The pain in her joints was a constant fire. Some days she lacked the strength even to rise from her cot. It was on one of those days that Yorick appeared at her door. He was the village's golden son, strong and handsome, and he had whispered promises of love to her under a summer moon before casting her aside like refuse, the moment her beauty began to fade, the moment her body became an inconvenience. He stood in her doorway, blocking the meager light, his face a mask of false concern. "Ilara," he said, his voice slick with an oily pity she despised. "The village is worried. The king, he asks about you. It is not right. A man like that should not concern himself with your condition." "My condition? I am not a weather pattern. I am a person. I am carrying your child." The words burned in her throat, but she lacked the energy to speak them. She simply stared at him, her silence a more potent accusation than any shout could be. He shifted uncomfortably. Maeve and the elders think you have drawn his attention with your sickness. They say you are a bad omen, that you will bring his wrath down on us all. They think, they think you should go. Go where? To the woods? To die? The unspoken words hung in the air between them. He wouldn't even say it. He was a coward, wrapping his cruelty in the supposed will of the village. This is your doing, Yorick, she finally rasped, her voice a dry whisper. You left me to this. He had the decency to flinch. It was not my choice, he lied. The sickness, it is a curse. I could not let it touch my family. He had chosen his family's comfort and reputation over her, over their own child. It was a betrayal so fundamental it had shattered her ability to trust. He is not a curse, a deep voice stated from behind Yorick. Kaelin stood there, silent as the grave, his presence instantly eclipsing Yorick's pathetic posturing. He must have walked from the woods, for no one had heard him approach. His dark eyes were fixed on Yorick, and they held a cold fury that made the air crackle. Yorick froze, his face draining of all color. He looked like a mouse that had just realized it was standing in the shadow of a hawk. You, Kaelin said, his voice lethally soft, will not speak to her again. It was not a request. It was a sentence being passed. Yorick swallowed hard, unable to speak, and stumbled backward, away from the hut, away from the king's terrifying presence. He practically ran, his flight a pathetic spectacle of his own cowardice. Kaelin watched him go, his expression unreadable, before turning his attention to her. He stepped inside the small hovel, and the space seemed to shrink around him. The air grew thick, charged with his power. He looked at her, lying pale and weak on the cot, and the fury in his eyes was replaced by that same raw, aching emotion she had seen before. He is the father, Kaelin stated, his gaze dropping to her belly. She gave a small, jerky nod, shame and sorrow washing over her. To be seen like this, in her weakness, rejected by the man who should have protected her, felt like having her soul laid bare for inspection. She braced for the king's judgment. A woman abandoned by one man was rarely seen as worthy by another. But he did not judge. He knelt beside her cot, his movements slow and deliberate. He reached out, not for her, but for the wooden bird he had left on her windowsill. He picked it up, his large fingers surprisingly gentle as they traced the delicate carving. In my lands, he said, his voice a low murmur. When a male chooses a mate, he protects her. He provides for her. He would tear the world apart before allowing harm to come to her or his young. His words were a simple statement of his own code, but they landed on her like a physical blow. They were everything Yorick was not, everything she had dreamed of and been denied. His eyes met hers, and the intensity in them was staggering. That man is not worthy of the life you carry. The declaration was absolute. He was not just condemning Yorick, he was validating her. He was saying that she and the child within her had a value that men like Yorick were too blind to see. He placed the bird gently in her hand, his fingers brushing against hers. His skin was warm, a shocking, vibrant heat against her own cold flesh. The touch was brief, fleeting, but it sent a tremor through her entire body. It was a spark of life in the encroaching darkness, a promise. He rose and left as silently as he had come, leaving her clutching the small wooden bird, her heart beating a little stronger, a little more fiercely, in the sudden, profound silence of his absence. He had defended her. He had shamed her tormentor. He had offered her a glimpse of a world where loyalty was absolute and protection was a given. And in doing so, he had woven a new, terrifying, and beautiful thread into the unraveling tapestry of her life. The confrontation with Yorick and Kaelin's subsequent intervention was a turning point. The village's fear, once a nebulous cloud, now had a focal point. It was her. Ilara, the sick girl, the abandoned woman, was the object of the terrifying king's attention. Their fear curdled into a hostile, panicked resentment. Maeve, the village elder with eyes as hard and gray as river stones, saw it as a direct threat. She believed Ilara's blight was contagious, not just to the body, but to their very fortune. The king's presence was a storm, and Ilara was the lightning rod that had drawn it to their valley. The whispers grew louder, more venomous. They no longer happened in the shadows but in the open, just loud enough for her to hear as she fetched her water. Witch, harbinger, she has enchanted him with her sickness. It was a madness born of terror. They could not challenge the king, so they turned their hatred upon his perceived weakness, his strange and inexplicable interest. The king, for his part, became a more constant fixture at the edge of her world. He no longer hid in the trees. He would stand openly at the edge of the clearing where her hovel sat, a silent, brooding sentinel. He never approached, never spoke, but his presence was a shield. While he watched, no villager dared to come near. It created a strange, isolated bubble around her, a kingdom of two with an invisible wall enforced by his sheer will. Inside this bubble, she grew weaker. The child inside her was growing, taking what little strength she had left. Her breaths became shallow, labored things. The world began to feel distant, its edges blurring as if she were looking through murky water. She spent most of her days in a state of semi-consciousness, drifting on a gray sea of pain and exhaustion. I'm not going to make it. The thought was no longer a fear, but a calm, cold certainty. My only regret is that I will take you with me, my sweet, nameless child. The breaking point came on a night when the moon was a sliver of bone in a black sky. A fever had taken hold of her, leaving her shivering and delirious. In her fevered dreams, she saw wolves with eyes of silver flame, running through a forest of endless night. She heard a howl, not of loneliness this time, but of a deep, soul-shattering grief. She awoke to the sound of angry voices outside her door. The flicker of torchlight danced through the cracks in the wooden planks. Must be done, before he returns. It was Maeve's voice, sharp and commanding. He rode out at dawn with his men. This is our only chance. We will take her to the woods. The spirits of the forest can claim what is theirs. It is a cleansing. A cleansing. They were going to offer her as a sacrifice to their own fear. The door creaked open, and Maeve stood there, her face a grim mask in the torchlight. Behind her were three of the village's strongest men, their expressions a mixture of fear and grim determination. They looked at her not as a person, but as a piece of filth to be disposed of. It is time, Ilara, Maeve said, her voice devoid of any warmth. You have brought a dark shadow upon us. You must take it with you. Panic gave Ilara a surge of adrenaline. She tried to push herself up, to fight, to scream, but her body betrayed her. A violent coughing fit seized her, leaving her limp and helpless. Two of the men grabbed her, arms, their grips rough and unyielding. They hauled her from the cot as if she were a sack of grain. The cold night air was a shock against her feverish skin. They dragged her through the village, her bare feet scraping against the muddy, frozen ground. A few villagers watched from their windows, their faces pale, silent specters at a funeral procession. No one spoke up. No one helped. They were all complicit in this, their silence a resounding cheer for her death. This was the final rejection, the ultimate act of abandonment. They were not just letting her die, they were ensuring it. They were casting her out into the darkness, into the domain of the beast they all feared, hoping it would solve their problem. They stopped at the edge of the Whisperwood. The trees were a wall of impenetrable black, the air thick with the smell of decay and ancient earth. The men threw her to the ground at the foot of a large gnarled oak, whose branches looked like skeletal arms reaching for the sky. May the forest have mercy on your soul, Maeve intoned, the words a hollow mockery. Then they turned and left, their torches a receding constellation of cowardice, leaving her alone in the crushing darkness. The cold seeped into her bones immediately, the fever raged, and the world began to tilt and spin. The sounds of the forest pressed in on her, the creak of branches, the rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth, the hoot of an owl. It was a place of old magic and older fears, and she was at its mercy. She curled into a ball, her arms wrapped around her belly, a final, instinctual act of love. I am here with you, she whispered to the life inside her. I will not leave you alone. Tears froze on her cheeks. The darkness began to close in, the edges of her vision fraying. This is it. This is the end. A profound sense of peace, the peace of absolute surrender, settled over her. Just as her eyes fluttered closed, a twig snapped nearby. It was a loud, deliberate sound. Not an animal. Something large was moving through the trees, coming toward her. A low growl rumbled through the darkness, a sound that vibrated not in her ears but in her chest. The stories were true. The beast of the Whisperwood had come for her. She did not have the strength to scream. She could only lie there, her heart a faint fluttering drum against the silence, waiting for the teeth and the claws. The growl deepened, but it was not the sound of mindless aggression. There was a raw, intelligent fury in it, an articulate rage that was directed not at her, but at the village, at the injustice of her fate. Out of the shadows, a shape emerged. It was not a man, not entirely. It was larger, broader, its form shifting in the faint moonlight that filtered through the canopy. And then, from the creature, 2 points of silver light ignited in the darkness. Eyes. The same silver-flecked eyes she had seen in the king's face. The creature took another step forward, and the illusion of moonlight and shadow resolved itself into a familiar form. It was Kalen, but a Kalen she had never seen before. His face was a mask of primal fury, his features sharpened, more angular. His canines seemed subtly elongated, and his nails looked thick, almost like claws. The power radiating from him was no longer contained. It poured off him in waves, a palpable force that made the very leaves on the ground tremble. He was the beast of the Whisperwood. The king was the monster of the legends. He saw her, lying broken at the foot of the ancient oak, and a sound tore from his throat, a guttural snarl of pure, undiluted agony. It was the howl from her dreams, the sound of profound grief and loss. He was at her side in an instant, dropping to his knees in the damp earth. The feral mask fell away, replaced by a desperate human anguish that was more terrifying than any monster. Alara. Her name was a shattered whisper on his lips. He reached for her, his hands hesitating for a moment as if afraid his touch would break her. Then, with an infinite tenderness that defied his savage appearance, he gathered her into his arms. She expected to feel cold leather and hard muscle. Instead, she was enveloped in a staggering, impossible heat. He was a furnace of life, and she was a shard of ice melting against him. She felt the powerful, steady beat of his heart against her ear, a rhythm that was a counterpoint to her own failing pulse. She was dying. She knew it with every fiber of her being, but in his arms, for the first time, she did not feel alone in it. I am so sorry, he murmured, his voice thick with a pain that seemed to tear him apart. I should not have left. I did not think they would dare. He held her tighter, tucking her head beneath his chin, his hand splayed protectively over her belly. He was shielding her, shielding their child, from the cold, from the darkness, from the world that had discarded them. This is what it feels like. This is what it feels like to be protected. The thought was a distant, wondrous thing. They will pay for this, he growled, the feral edge returning to his voice. Every one of them. He looked down at her, his silver eyes searching her face in the gloom. He could see the life draining from her, the gray pallor of her skin, the shallow, ragged nature of her breaths. He knew. He is too late. The thought floated through her mind without sorrow. It was simply a fact. No, he said, as if hearing her unspoken thought. His voice was raw, fierce. I will not let you go. He shifted his grip, cradling her more securely against his chest. There is a way, a chance, but it will change you. It will bind you to me, to my life, to my world. She didn't understand his words, not fully. Her mind was too clouded with fever and the encroaching fog of death. She only understood the desperate plea in his voice. He was offering her something, a last, impossible hope. What are you? She managed to whisper, the words barely a puff of air. His silver eyes held hers. The last of his human glamour seemed to fall away, and she saw him for what he truly was. Ancient, powerful, and not entirely human. He was a creature of two worlds, man and wolf, civilization and wilderness. I am Lycan, he said, the word seeming to hang in the frozen air. And you are my mate, my Anamkara, my soul's heart. I have felt you dying for weeks, and it has been a blade in my own soul. Fated mates. A story for children, a myth whispered by old women at the fire. It couldn't be real. And yet, the way he looked at her, the way he held her as if she were the most precious thing in the universe, felt more real than anything she had ever known. The life you carry, it is why the sickness has taken you so quickly, he explained, his voice urgent. A human body cannot sustain the child of a lichen. It is burning you away from the inside. Yorick. The thought was a faint shock. He wasn't the father. Or rather, he was. But he wasn't human. He must have had the lichen blood in him, dormant, unknown. A recessive trait that had now emerged with devastating power in his child, in their child. The child she was carrying was part of Kaylin's world. Her child was like him, and it was killing her. There is only one way to save you both, Kaylin said, his gaze intense, burning into her. My bite, the transformation. It will heal you, make you strong. It will make you like me, immortal. He was offering her his own life, his own nature, a gift of impossible price. But she could see the fear in his eyes. It was not a simple cure. It may kill you, he admitted, his voice ragged with honesty. Your body is weak. The change. It is violent. But it is the only chance you have, the only chance we have. He laid the choice before her, a stark and terrifying precipice. Certain death in the cold, or a chance at life, wrapped in agony and transformation. She looked at his face, at the desperation and the fierce, protective love etched there. She felt the faint, weak flutter of the life inside her, a life that was half his, half hers. A life that deserved a chance to see the sun. She had been given nothing but cruelty and rejection. This man, this king, this beast, was offering her everything. Forever. She lifted a trembling hand, her fingers brushing against his jaw. It was the first time she had ever willingly touched him. Yes, she whispered. The word was small, but it was the biggest decision of her life. It was an act of ultimate trust, a leap of faith into the heart of the monster who held her as if she were a queen. A tremor of relief, so profound it was almost violent, shook his powerful frame. He lowered his head, his forehead resting against hers for a moment, his breath warm on her cold skin. Ilara, he breathed, her name a prayer, a vow. You will be my queen. You will never be cold or hungry or alone again. I swear it on my soul. He shifted her in his arms, laying her gently on a bed of moss, his body a shield against the biting wind. He tilted her head to the side, exposing the pale, fragile skin of her neck. The fever was a raging inferno now, her vision swimming in and out of focus. She was only vaguely aware of the forest around them, of the cold earth beneath her. Her entire existence had narrowed to his face, his silver eyes, the promise and the terror of what was to come. I am dying, she thought, a strange sense of calm washing over her. And I am being born. He lowered his head, his dark hair brushing against her cheek. She could feel his breath, hot and panting, against her skin. She saw his lips part, revealing the elongated canines that were no longer hidden. They gleamed in the faint moonlight, beautiful and deadly. He hesitated for a heartbeat, his eyes locking with hers one last time, filled with a silent, desperate question. She gave the faintest of nods. Do it. He closed his eyes, and then he bit down. The pain was instantaneous, a blinding, white-hot agony that eclipsed everything else. It was a lightning strike, a fire that seared through her veins, starting at her neck and exploding through her entire body. A scream was torn from her throat, raw and animalistic, a sound of pure torment. It felt as if every cell in her body was being ripped apart and remade. Her bones felt like they were breaking and resetting, her muscles tearing and weaving themselves back together into something new, something stronger. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of agony and sensation. Through the pain, she was aware of him, of his presence wrapped around her. He was holding her down, not with cruelty, but with a desperate strength, keeping her from thrashing and harming herself. He was murmuring to her, his voice a low, constant rumble in her ear, anchoring her to reality. Stay with me, Alara. Fight. Hold on. I am here. I will not leave you. His words were a lifeline in the raging sea of her transformation. The sickness, the rot that had been her constant companion, felt like it was being burned away, cauterized by the venomous fire of his bite. She could feel new strength, a raw, primal power flooding into her limbs, pushing out the weakness, the decay. It was the most excruciating, terrifying, and profoundly vital thing she had ever experienced. And then there was the child, the small, fluttering life within her, which had grown so weak, suddenly surged. She felt it respond to the change, accepting the lichen magic, thriving in it. It was no longer a parasite draining her life away. It was a part of her, a part of this new, wild power. The pain crested, holding her in its grip for an eternity. And then, just as she felt she would shatter into a million pieces, it began to recede. The fire in her veins cooled to a warm, humming glow. The agony subsided, leaving behind a deep, thrumming power in her bones. Her ragged, shallow breaths deepened, her lungs filling with air for what felt like the first time in months. The world swam, back into focus, sharper, brighter, more vibrant than she had ever known. She opened her eyes. Kalen was leaning over her, his face etched with worry, his silver eyes wide. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and his breath caught. Alara? Her name was tentative, hopeful. She pushed herself up onto her elbows. The movement was effortless. There was no pain in her joints, no weakness in her muscles. She felt strong, alive, more alive than she had ever been. She looked down at her hands. The skin was no longer pale and translucent. It was flushed with health, with life. The gray pallor was gone. She touched her face, her hair. The brittle, dull strands felt thick and lustrous. She was whole, healed. She looked back at him, and a slow smile spread across her face. The first genuine smile in what felt like a lifetime. Kalen, she said, and her voice was not a weak rasp, but clear and strong, filled with a new resonant music. The relief that washed over his face was so profound, it was like watching the sun break through a storm. He let out a shaky breath and gathered her into his arms, holding her with a fierce, possessive tenderness that made her heart ache with a beautiful, unfamiliar joy. He buried his face in her hair, his powerful shoulders shaking with emotion. "You are here," he murmured against her skin. "You are alive." She wrapped her arms around his neck, holding him just as tightly. The cold was gone. The fear was gone. The loneliness was gone. In the heart of the dark, wild woods, in the arms of the beast who was her king, Ilara was finally, truly home. Waking up was a revelation. It was not the slow, painful crawl back to consciousness she had known for so long, but a sudden, sharp snap into awareness. The world assaulted her senses with an almost overwhelming clarity. She could smell the damp earth, the individual scent of every leaf and piece of moss within 100 paces. She could hear the frantic heartbeat of a field mouse hiding in the undergrowth 50 feet away, the slow, syrupy drip of sap inside a pine tree, the whisper of the wind as it wound through the high branches. Her vision was so sharp that she could see the intricate, crystalline patterns of frost on a single blade of grass. Everything was new, vibrant, intensely alive. She was lying on a bed of soft furs in a cave, a fire crackling merrily in a stone hearth, casting a warm golden glow over the walls. The air was dry and warm. She was dressed in a soft linen shift that felt like silk against her new skin. Kaylin sat in a carved wooden chair by the fire, watching her. The feral intensity was gone, replaced by a quiet, anxious tenderness. She sat up, the furs pooling around her waist. The movement was fluid, effortless. She looked down at her body. Her skin was smooth, flawless, radiating a healthy warmth. The gaunt skeletal frame was gone, replaced by lean, strong muscle. Her belly was still round and full, but it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a source of power, a nexus of the new life that hummed within them both. She placed a hand over it and felt a strong, definitive kick in response, a joyful greeting from her child, who was no longer dying but thriving. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of gratitude and overwhelming relief. "Is this real?" she whispered, her voice husky. Kaylin was by her side in a heartbeat, kneeling on the furs, his large, warm hand covering hers on her belly. "It is real," he confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. "You are healed. You are safe." He looked at her as if she were a miracle, his silver eyes drinking in the sight of her, the color in her cheeks, the light in her eyes. "You are more beautiful than the rising sun," he murmured, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. The intimacy of the moment was staggering. She had gone from being the most reviled person in her village to being the most revered person in his world. It was a dizzying shift. He was her king, her savior, her mate. The word still felt foreign, mythical, but the truth of it resonated in her soul. There was a connection between them now, a shimmering thread of awareness that ran deeper than sight or sound. She could feel his emotions as if they were her own, his profound relief, his fierce protectiveness, his deep, unwavering love. It was a love that had seen her at her absolute worst, at her most broken and diseased, and had not flinched. A self-deprecating thought bubbled up, a ghost of her old insecurities. He must have very low standards then. The thought was so absurd it made a small laugh escape her lips. It was a rusty sound, unfamiliar. Kaylin's brow furrowed in confusion. "What is it?" he asked. She shook her head, a real smile touching her lips. "Nothing. Just adjusting." The tension broke, and he smiled back, a rare, breathtaking sight that transformed his severe face, making him look younger, almost boyish. "There is much to adjust to," he agreed. But we have time. We have forever. He helped her to her feet. She felt a little unsteady, not from weakness, but from the sheer, unaccustomed power thrumming through her limbs. It was like learning to walk all over again in a body that was infinitely more capable. He led her to the mouth of the cave. It was dawn. The sun was just beginning to crest the mountains, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold. The valley of Oakhaven was spread out below them, shrouded in a thin layer of mist. From this vantage point, it looked small, insignificant, a place of bad memories that no longer had any power over her. "This is my home," Kalen said, his arm wrapped securely around her waist. "These mountains, this forest, and you are its queen." He was not just offering her a place, he was offering her a position, a purpose. He saw her not as a refugee to be pitied, but as an equal to stand beside him. She breathed in the crisp morning air, feeling it fill her new, powerful lungs. The scent of the village, of wood smoke, livestock, and unwashed bodies, was a foul miasma on the wind. She could smell their fear. It was a sharp, acrid scent, like soured milk. It was the scent of the people who had dragged her into the woods to die. A cold, hard anger, an emotion she had never been strong enough to feel before, solidified in her chest. It was a clean, righteous anger, the anger of a wolf defending its territory. "They cannot go unpunished," she said, her voice low and steady. It was not a request for vengeance, but a statement of fact. An injustice had been done, and the world felt unbalanced because of it. Kalen looked down at her, a flicker of surprise and pride in his eyes. He had expected her to be afraid, to want to hide. He had not expected this core of steel. "No," he agreed, his voice a low growl. "They will not. They will answer to their queen." The words sent a shiver down her spine, a thrill of power and belonging. She was no longer Alara the outcast, Alara the dying girl. She was the mate of the Alpha King, and the people who had condemned her were about to face a reckoning. The sun rose higher, burning away the mist, and for the first time Alara looked toward her future not with fear, but with a fierce, burning hope. They descended from the mountain as the sun reached its zenith, not with the stealth of their previous encounters, but with the open, undeniable authority of rulers returning to their domain. Kalen's warriors, who had returned from their patrol to find the cataclysmic events that had transpired, flanked them. They moved with a grim, silent purpose, their loyalty to their alpha and his new mate a palpable, dangerous force. Alara walked beside Kalen, not behind him. She wore clothes borrowed from one of his supply packs, soft leather trousers and a tunic, practical and strong. Her long, dark hair, now thick and vibrant, flowed freely down her back. She felt his strength beside her, a steady, comforting presence, but she drew on her own as well. The power of the transformation hummed in her blood, a wild music that gave her a confidence she had never known. She was no longer a victim of this place. She was its judge. Their arrival in the village square was like the dropping of a stone into a silent pond. The ripples of shock and terror were immediate. Villagers froze where they stood, their faces paling, their eyes widening in disbelief and fear. They stared at Alara, at the impossible health that radiated from her, at the way she walked with her head held high, at the possessive way the terrifying king stood by her side. They did not see a woman they knew. They saw a specter, a miracle, a terrifying omen. This was not the broken, dying girl they had left for the wolves. This was something else entirely, something powerful. Maeve was the first to find her voice, stepping forward from the crowd that had gathered, her face a mask of defiant disbelief. "Witchcraft," she hissed, her voice trembling but still laced with venom. "You have made a pact with the beast! You are a monster!" Before Kaelin could even react, Ilara took a step forward, her gaze locking with the old woman's. "You speak of monsters, Maeve?" Ilara's new voice was calm, clear, and carried across the square, silencing all other sound. "I see a woman who led a frightened mob to drag a sick, pregnant woman from her bed and leave her to die of cold and fear. Where is the monster in that story?" Maeve recoiled as if struck. The directness of the accusation, coming from the once timid Ilara, stunned her. The other villagers shifted, their eyes darting between Ilara and Maeve, the first seeds of doubt and guilt planted in their collective conscience. From the back of the crowd, a man pushed his way forward. It was Jorik. His face was a mess of confusion, awe, and a dawning, greedy opportunism. He stared at Ilara, at her newfound beauty and vitality, and the scavenger in him saw a prize he had foolishly discarded. "Ilara," he said, his voice taking on a tone of wonder and ownership, you are healed. It is a miracle." He started toward her, his arms outstretched. "Our child is safe." Kaelin moved so fast he was a blur. One moment he was beside Ilara, the next he was in front of Yorick, a single hand clamped around the man's throat, lifting him effortlessly off the ground. Yorick choked, his legs kicking uselessly, his face turning a mottled purple. The crowd gasped and shrank back. "You will not speak her name," Kaelin snarled, the sound a low, feral growl that promised death. "You will not look at her. The child she carries is of my blood, not yours. You forfeited any claim you might have had when you left her to die." He was revealing the truth, not for the village's sake, but for Ilara's, severing the final tie to her past. He was declaring her and her child as his, completely and absolutely. Ilara watched, a cold calm settling over her. She felt no pity for Yorick. He was a symbol of the conditional, selfish world she had left behind. He had only wanted her when she was beautiful and convenient. He had never seen her. "Let him go, Kaelin," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He looked at her, his silver eyes still blazing with fury. She met his gaze, and in that silent look, a universe of understanding passed between them. This was her justice to deliver, not his. He hesitated, then released his grip. Jorik collapsed to the ground, gasping and sputtering, clutching his bruised throat. Ilara walked toward him, stopping a few feet from where he knelt in the mud. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with fear and a pathetic, pleading hope. "Yorick," she said, her voice devoid of heat or hatred, filled only with a profound and final finality. "The woman you knew is dead. She died in the forest, alone and cold, because of your cowardice. I am what grew from her grave. You have no part of me. You have no part of my child. We are nothing to you." She turned her back on him, a simple, dismissive act that was more damning than any curse. She walked back to Kaelin's side, slipping her hand into his. He enclosed it in his own, his grip warm and strong. Together, they faced the stunned and silent village. "This valley," Kaelin announced, his voice ringing with the authority of a king, "is under my protection now, because my queen has chosen to show you mercy." He looked down at Ilara, a silent question in his eyes. She knew what he was asking. Did she want vengeance? Did she want them to suffer as she had suffered? She looked at their terrified faces, Maeve's, now crumpled in defeat, the men who had dragged her, now unable to meet her eyes, the silent watchers, now drowning in their shame. And she felt nothing. They were small. Their hatred was a weak, flickering candle against the bonfire of her new life. "They are not worth our anger," she said softly, for his ears only. "Let them live with what they have done. That is punishment enough." He nodded, accepting her judgment. He turned back to the crowd. You will provide a tribute of grain and livestock every season. It will be given to the families my queen deems most in need. You will learn generosity. You will learn to care for your weak. That is my decree." He squeezed her hand. It was over. Her past was a closed book. She did not look back as they walked away from the square, away from the village of Oakhaven, leaving its people to the quiet damnation of their own consciences. Their future was ahead of them, in the wild mountains that were now their home. The months that followed were a time of healing and discovery. Kaelin's kingdom was not a place of stone castles and courtiers, but of the deep, untamed wilderness. His people were the lichen packs that roamed the mountains, living in hidden communities that were more like extended families than villages. They were fierce and wild, but they possessed a deep, unwavering loyalty to their alpha king and a profound reverence for the concept of the mated pair. When Kaelin brought Alara to them, they did not see a former human or an outsider. They saw their Anam Cara, the other half of their king's soul. They welcomed her with a simple, profound acceptance that healed the last of the wounds her old life had left on her spirit. She learned about her new body, her new senses, her new strength. Kaelin was a patient teacher, guiding her as she learned to control the power that now flowed through her veins. He taught her how to track by scent, how to run for miles without tiring, how to hear the secrets the wind whispered through the pines. With him, she felt not like a monster, but like a more complete version of herself, as if a part of her soul that had always been sleeping had finally awakened. Their love deepened with every passing day, a quiet, powerful thing that needed few words. They communicated in shared glances, in the brush of hands, in the simple comfort of each other's presence. He had seen the very worst of her, and she had seen the wild beast that lived within him, and they had chosen each other completely. It was a love forged in desperation and death, and it was stronger than any force on earth. The cave where he had first taken her became their home, expanded and made comfortable with warm furs, carved furniture, and a hearth that was never cold. It was a sanctuary, a haven where the ghosts of her past could not reach her. Her pregnancy progressed easily now, her body strong and capable, nurturing the powerful life within her. She felt the child's moods, its strength, a tiny echo of her own bond with Kaelin. This child was a bridge between their two worlds, a symbol of their impossible love. The day she went into labor, a warm summer storm was rolling through the mountains. The air was electric, charged with energy. Kaelin never left her side. He held her, breathed with her, his strength a rock for her to cling to. There was no fear, only a powerful, shared anticipation. The birth was quick, primal, and blessedly easy. As the storm broke outside, their child entered the world with a healthy, lusty cry that echoed the thunder. It was a boy. He had Ilara's dark hair, but when he opened his eyes, they were the same impossible, startling silver as his father's. He was perfect, a beautiful fusion of both of them. Kaelin took the baby, his large warrior's hands impossibly gentle as he held his son for the first time. The look on his face was one of such profound wonder and love that it brought fresh tears to Ilara's eyes. He looked from his son to her, his expression filled with a reverence that humbled her. "Liam," he whispered, the name meaning strong-willed warrior in his people's tongue. "Our son." He placed the baby in her arms. Liam snuggled against her, his tiny mouth rooting for purchase. As he began to nurse, a feeling of such complete and utter contentment washed over Ilara that it felt like the settling of the earth itself. Every moment of pain, every tear, every second of loneliness she had ever endured had been worth it to arrive at this single, perfect moment. She had a son, she had a mate, she had a family, she had a home. She had been cast out, left to die. But from that death, she had been reborn into a life more full and beautiful than she could have ever imagined. She was no longer defined by her scars, but by the love that had healed them. Later, as the storm passed and the setting sun cast long, golden fingers of light into the cave, Kalen sat beside her on the furs, his arm around her, their son sleeping peacefully in her arms. They watched the light fade from the sky, a comfortable silence settling between them. She thought of the cold hovel, of the hopeless despair that had once been her entire world. It felt like a story about someone else, a lifetime ago. "Do you ever miss it?" Kalen asked softly, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "The sun on the fields? The village life?" She considered his question. She thought of the scent of baking bread, the sound of the blacksmith's hammer, the festivals at harvest time. And she felt nothing. No nostalgia, no regret. "I miss nothing," she said, her voice full of a certainty that rang with absolute truth. "Everything I have ever wanted, everything I could ever need is right here." She leaned her head against his shoulder, breathing in his familiar scent of pine and wildness. He tightened his arm around her, his lips brushing against her hair. The world outside, the world that had rejected her, could continue on without her. It no longer mattered. Her world was here, in this cave, in the arms of her king, with the steady, sleeping breath of their son against her heart. She had walked through the valley of the shadow of death, and she had not been consumed. She had been transformed. Love had not just saved her life. It had given her a life worth saving, and a forever to live it. The silence she lived in now was not one of sorrow, but of a deep and abiding peace, the sacred quiet where a family's love story truly begins.